The air inside the American war base at Kandahar seemed to thrum with electricity, even at midnight. Every wall glowed blue from rows of flickering monitors, each one a live feed from Predator drones hovering over a stretch of Afghan earth, the fabled, lethal fields of Kandahar province. Behind those screens stood American generals, the kind of men who'd seen everything war could throw at them. But on this early September night in 2006, even they were silent, transfixed by what was unfolding. A battle so relentless and brutal it would change their view of warfare itself. On the glowing screens, clusters of distant figures in tan camouflage moved with cautious determination through a labyrinth of tangled grapevines and ancient mud walls. These weren't U.S. Marines or British paratroopers. Instead, the tags on the uniforms read Canada, a name that, till this moment, barely registered on the Pentagon's list of combat legends. American officers whispered to each other in the shadows, tracking the movement of their northern allies with growing disbelief. Canada had sent only around 2,000 soldiers to this nightmare sector. The Taliban had massed almost 10 times that, a fanatical army dug deep and daring NATO to come and meet them head-on. What happened next would become legend, not just among Canadians but inside the very halls of the U.S. military machine. Radios at the base burst with chaotic calls, gunfire, frantic coordinates, screams for support. The Canadians didn't hesitate. As the bullets rained down, these soldiers pressed forward, dragging wounded friends to safety, standing waist-deep in combat that looked like a scene from World War II. Close quarter, face-to-face, nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. American generals watched as one after another fell, only for more to take their place in the murderous fields. For many in that base, it was the first time they'd seen Canada at war, truly at war. Later, days after the smoke cleared, an American commander would say he'd never seen anything like it. Not in Iraq, not in Somalia, not anywhere. But as the first disastrous hours played out across those screens, commanders faced a gut-wrenching question: would the Canadians hold or would they break? Would they become just another cautionary tale in the endless graveyard of empires? As dawn approached over Kandahar, inside that fortress of sandbags and satellite dishes, everyone was searching for answers. No one on that American war base could have guessed their image of Canada would never be the same. What they were about to witness was not just a battle, but a revelation, one that would shake the Pentagon and rewrite the rules inside every NATO headquarters. But what exactly did those generals see that day? What was it about those 2,000 Canadians that left America's finest stunned and silent? Why, even years later, do Special Forces officers and War College professors still invoke the name Operation Medusa like a secret code? The answers lie hidden in the dust and fire of Kandahar's most infamous fields, a story so intense, so raw, even the Pentagon couldn't keep it quiet. And if you think you know how this war played out, think again. The real shock was still to come. Inside the buzzing operations center of the American war base at Kandahar, the story was supposed to be over. The war had been won. The Pentagon's top brass had declared victory years ago, splashing images of fleeing Taliban fighters and collapsing strongholds across every U.S. news channel. Every map on the giant wall screens showed secure zones. Every briefing highlighted progress. The official word was that Afghanistan was entering a new era, with U.S.-led forces training a new government, building schools, and paving dusty roads. From the comfort of military command rooms filled with the steady hum of computers and AC units beating back the desert heat, Afghanistan seemed manageable, an assignment, not a crisis. Spectacular images of U.S. jets thundering overhead, Green Berets calling in surgical airstrikes, elite SEAL teams moving through Rocky Mountains. This was the image that had been locked in American minds. Bin Laden fled, Al-Qaeda shattered, Taliban on the run. Any remaining threats were meant to be scattered bands planting roadside bombs in the dark. What a lie that turned out to be. 5 years after their supposed defeat, the Taliban had become the nightmare that stalked every ops meeting on the base. Reports started trickling in, then flooding. Drone feeds and intercepted comms revealed a horrifying truth. The enemy wasn't melted away, they were multiplying. In Kandahar alone, attacks had skyrocketed by nearly 400% in 12 months. Where there had been dozens of threats, now there were thousands. Across thick binders stamped top secret, intelligence officers scribbled grim notes. The situation was slipping out of control. U.S. base security went on high alert. Commanders barked orders for more air cover, more armored patrols, longer convoy routes. But outside the wall, the game was changing. 25 kilometers west of the base, in a region called Panjwai, the Taliban weren't just sneaking attacks, they were massing. American satellite imagery flashed up what seemed impossible. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of fighters gathering in villages, fortifying old mud compounds, building bunkers, digging ditches like a real army. It was a move that went against every rule in the insurgency playbook. Instead of hiding in the mountains, the Taliban were daring NATO to come and fight. And everyone inside the American war base knew exactly what that challenge meant: blood. The order of battle briefings from the intelligence staff turned more dire by the hour. The numbers hit home with chilling clarity: nearly 2,000 Taliban under direct command, operating not as scattered terrorists but as a united, crazed army. A storm was gathering just beyond the perimeter. Informants and satellite feeds alike painted the same picture. Dozens of Taliban units, some led by notorious commanders straight off U.S. kill lists, were now in the open, pulling fighters from every corner. They had stashed heavy weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, machine guns capable of shredding a Humvee in seconds. American analysts realized with a sense of dread this was shaping up to be the largest Taliban ground offensive since the fall of Kabul. Panic rippled through the base. Briefings in steel-reinforced bunkers got sharper, more urgent. Everyone started watching the outpost maps more carefully. The threat was so real that even U.S. Army Rangers, veterans of the hardest strikes, swapped nervous looks. Inside those secure halls, you could see the denial crumbling. Suddenly, Afghanistan was not some small cleanup op, it was falling apart, and the next push was coming right for Kandahar. All at once, a decision had to be made. The Taliban were staking their claim with a show of force not seen since the Soviets bled out in these same hills. But who would stand against them? At first, it seemed sure that American units would take point. After all, this was the heart of America's territory, a cornerstone of U.S. dominance in the war. Yet through the coded chatter and hurried meetings, a message filtered in: Canadian troops newly arrived would be the ones sent to hold the line. Across the base, there was disbelief. Canadian soldiers stepping up. Everyone in the ops room remembered the blue-helmeted peacekeepers from UN brochures, not hard-edged combat infantry. The bet inside the wire was simple: the Canadians wouldn't last a week in the furnace of Panjwai. The Taliban outnumbered them nearly 10-1, and these weren't summer interns. They were combat-hardened, ruthless, and ready to die for every inch. So what drove the Canadians to step where so many refused? Why would a country known for apologies and diplomacy send its soldiers into hell with the enemy massing for a bloodbath? American generals circled their maps, strategizing. This mattered not just for politics but for every soldier on the ground. If Kandahar fell, it might unravel the entire Western effort in Afghanistan. The war base at Kandahar shuddered into full alert. Everyone watched, everyone waited. The battle line was drawn, and as the sun rose over the razor-wire fences, nobody dared predict what would come next. But the world was about to find out what happens when everything people thought they knew about Canadian soldiers got put to the ultimate test. Inside the USA warbase at Kandahar Airfield, the atmosphere crackled with whispered doubts and unspoken wagers. Every screen glowed with updates, intel briefings, drone feeds, tactical maps, but there was one question hanging in the air. Could the Canadians really handle the job? In every secure conference room, around every operational table, the topic wasn't just numbers and ordnance, it was reputation. The U.S. military, forged in a generation's worth of desert warfare, looked at their Canadian allies with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Canadian uniforms were clean, the faces fresh, the voices polite, even as rumors swirled that the Pentagon's higher-ups considered their northern neighbors peacekeepers, not warfighters. To understand just how much was at stake, you have to see the world through those American eyes. At this USA war base, where legends like Delta Force and the 75th Rangers prepared to launch missions at a moment's notice, the unspoken rules were clear. Real warriors earned respect the hard way, not by reputation, but by facing the enemy with unwavering resolve. The Canadian military for years had been a supportive presence, helpful, reliable, skilled at logistics and humanitarian missions. They handed out food, they built wells, they restored schools shelled by endless waves of conflict. But fighting tooth and nail, house by house, that was rarely the headline. Around the base, hallway chatter revealed the real doubts. Are these guys really up for a firefight? One American sergeant remarked to a buddy as they cleaned their sidearms in the dim light of an armory tent. Others looked at the blue berets stored in Canadian supply lockers and rolled their eyes. The story they told each other was always the same: the Canadians were backup, not the tip of the spear. But history had another story hidden beneath layers of dust. Forgotten in the chaos of modern headlines, the Canadians had once been relentless warriors. Old military field manuals, kept in the archives at the war base, still listed Canadian stormtroopers as fearsome opponents from World War II, D-Day at Juno Beach, the brutal climb at Vimy Ridge. There was a time Canadian regiments launched bayonet charges across open fields and didn't stop until the enemy line was broken. That history, however, was buried by decades of peacekeeping tour, clean blue helmets, and pictures of smiling soldiers handing out candy. The legacy faded as American dominance on the battlefield grew. But now, out beyond the wire of the American base, a new reality was unfolding. The Canadian High Command, led by General Rick Hillier, a straight-talking, hard-charging officer known throughout the Pentagon circles, pushed for a seat at the table where real risks were taken. Canada didn't just send observers, they volunteered to take over the heart of enemy country, Kandahar. The move stunned analysts back in Washington. Why risk everything in the deadliest province in the country? Why step up for the fight no one else wanted? The answer, read later in intercepted emails and private memos inside U.S. command trailers, was blunt. Because Canada is tired of being thought of as soft. American war base brass watched as shipments of Canadian vehicles, LAVs, artillery, and troop carriers rolled onto the tarmac. These weren't symbolic gestures. The 2,300-strong force included some of the nation's elite: the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the Royal Canadian Regiment, deadly armored cavalry from Lord Strathcona's Horse, gunners from the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery. Every Canadian unit had trained beside U.S. forces, learned modern American combat doctrine, and fielded advanced tech. The difference was, for the first time in half a century, they were being asked to use all of it not for peacekeeping, but for battle. As briefing slides flipped by in the main operations center, U.S. generals saw the risk. The numbers didn't lie. On paper, Canada's entire commitment to Kandahar was dwarfed by the enemy's massing horde. In field briefings, U.S. advisors quietly voiced worries that if the Canadians failed, if they were pushed back, humiliated, or forced to call in American rescue, the entire coalition would suffer a blow. The Taliban, watching through their own network of spies and informants, wanted nothing more than to break the new arrivals. Rumors drifted back to the base. Taliban commanders joked the Canadians would run back to their blue helmets after the first blood was spilled. Yet as battle plans took shape, something unexpected happened. The mood shifted inside the American war base. U.S. officers began to see flashes of cold determination in their Canadian counterparts. No hesitation, no apologies. The Canadians checked weapons, wrote final letters home, and gathered for final briefings not with nerves but with a shivering, quiet fury. As the day of battle approached, one American major, watching from behind an array of screens as Canadian columns moved into position, remarked, almost to himself, "If they pull this off, everything changes." In that moment, the old stories faded. In their place was a new chapter waiting for its first line to be written. The next hours would show whether the legends from the archives and the whispers at the war base would finally collide, out there, among the mud walls and burning fields, with the whole world watching. From deep inside the USA war base at Kandahar, the incoming reports painted a picture that sent a chill through every command tent. For weeks, the intelligence section had been dissecting signals, photographs, and overheard Taliban chatter on encrypted radios. What emerged on those glowing screens wasn't just the standard guerrilla hit-and-run. This was different. A strategy straight from a nightmare scenario, designed for maximum bloodshed. The enemy had learned. Years of fighting the world's best-equipped military had taught the Taliban that hit-and-fade attacks would only get so far. Their new plan was nothing short of audacious. Fight NATO as an army. Not shadows, not phantoms, but a head-on collision with Western force. And the place they chose for their last stand was no accident. It was deliberately chosen to maximize destruction for anyone, even those with the prestige and might of the American military machine. Every day, in the war base's classified briefings, the updates became more dire. Panjwai was transforming. The Taliban weren't hiding in distant caves or mountain passes this time. They were right in the ancient villages, turning each home into a bunker, every alley into a trap. American analysts built sand table models in the base's planning rooms and stared grimly at the details. Heavy fortifications, overlapping fields of fire, tunnel networks between walls, all positioned to turn the lush environment into one sprawling kill zone. Worst of all, the grape fields in Panjwai became the stuff of legend almost overnight. In the safety of the USA war base, one might think a green belt of vineyards would be harmless, maybe even beautiful. But from the drone feeds, American officers saw what their soldiers called the Green Maze. Every grapevine stood atop a mud row 4 to 6 feet high, blocking the view and stopping vehicles dead. In between, thick marijuana plants rose like a green curtain, some more than 10 feet tall, creating perfect hiding spots for Taliban ambush teams. Vehicles couldn't push through, ground troops vanished from view. Anyone advancing into this labyrinth would have to literally fight, step by step, blind, every movement a guess whether it would be their last. And the Taliban knew this. Through every intercepted radio message, it became clear. Enemy commanders had pre-planned every foot of ground, pre-registered mortar positions, and set up booby traps wherever Canadians might dare to crawl or run. They built sniper nests inside raisin huts, 4 feet thick with ancient mud brick, so tough that American 155 artillery sometimes bounced off without leaving more than a scar. American war base planners ran grim simulations. The numbers were brutal. Taliban fighters in Panjwai alone outnumbered the entire Canadian force in the province. Intelligence found proof of foreign operatives, fighters from Chechnya, Pakistan, and even Arab states who'd faced down the best in Iraq and Chechnya. These men carried heavy weapons capable of piercing armored vehicles, automatic grenade launchers, and mortars with zeroed-in maps marked by blood. But most chilling to veterans at the USA war base was the unsettling precision. This wasn't a wild mob, it was a disciplined, battle-hardened force. Their leadership, men like the infamous Mullah Dadullah, a brutal commander feared across Afghanistan, directed the fight with ruthless authority. They knew exactly how NATO would try to move, and they positioned themselves just close enough to families and civilians to force hesitation. Bomb that hut and kill the Taliban, yes. But do it and risk innocent lives. For US-based strategists, this dilemma was the essence of modern war. The enemy turned your morals into their weapon. Inside the steaming command rooms, the Americans pieced it all together. The Taliban were laying a trap so dangerous that a single mistake could end not just lives, but the entire image of control the Western coalition projected from the glittering lights and antennas of the war base. The Canadians would have to assault a real fortress, the kind of battlefield not seen since Fallujah or maybe even as far back as Vietnam. One thought dominated the war base as battle approached. The Canadians were walking into hell on earth. The question burning through every late-night meeting and whispered comms was simple. Could any force, even one backed by American technology and NATO air power, survive what the enemy had built? The Taliban weren't just waiting, they were taunting, challenging any who believed themselves warriors. As the final orders went out across encrypted channels and convoys rumbled across the wire, every pair of American eyes at Kandahar war base was fixed on one spot, the heart of the Green Maze, where 1,000 Taliban guns waited in silence for the test to begin. As dawn broke over the USA war base at Kandahar, the command centers buzzed with a tense energy that could be felt all the way to the steel benches in the briefing tents. Every screen broadcast the same message. It was time for the first major test of Operation Medusa. American generals, battle-hardened men who'd survived everything from Iraq's urban chaos to convoy ambushes on endless desert roads, were already on edge. The maps were covered in so many enemy symbols now that, according to one intelligence officer, it looked like a hornet's nest had spilled right onto the heart of Kandahar province. American and Canadian liaison teams filled the operations room, eyes never leaving those flickering feeds. They could see Canadian convoys moving with purpose, tracked by thermal cameras as they rumbled through dust-choked lanes and under grape arbors heavy with green. Everyone at the USA war base, from the commanding officers in the war room to the sentries on the outer wall, understood. The Taliban weren't waiting in the shadows. They were laying an invitation to carnage. It started with routine precision. On paper, the plan seemed airtight. Allied forces push in from multiple angles, flush out Taliban redoubts, control the crossroads, and bring peace by force. Objective Rugby, codenamed by Canadian planners and noted on every USA war base monitor, was the first crucible. Charles' company of the Royal Canadian Regiment was given the unenviable order to lead the way, right through the thickest heart of the Taliban's newly fortified death zone. The moment they advanced, chaos struck. Taliban machine guns erupted from windows, ditches, and gaps in the grape rows, machine gun tracers slicing through the smoky air. Mortar shells exploded with shocking precision. They'd been prearranged, just as the enemy's intercepted broadcast had warned. In the control center, American officers leaned forward, knuckles white against polished oak, as their monitors turned into a kaleidoscope of muzzle flashes and mayhem. Radios in the USA war base squawked urgent, desperate updates. We are pinned down, multiple casualties. Enemy all around. Request immediate fire support, over. For the first time in years, American analysts witnessed Allied vehicles bogged down, lavs stuck in soft earth, unable to pivot or reverse, while Taliban RPGs whistled overhead. Dense vegetation made spotting the enemy nearly impossible. Every bush was potentially lethal. The Canadians, running from one piece of cover to the next, found themselves enveloped by fire from three sides, caught in a crossfire as brutal as anything the war base had tracked in Fallujah or Mosul. And then Catastrophe. In the blue-lit calm of the USA war base's air operations bunker, a call for close air support went out. American Warthog attack planes roared in at low altitude, ready to unleash their devastating 13 cannons. But in a split second that still haunts war colleges today, a fatal error in coordinates was relayed. The A-10s didn't target Taliban lines, they wiped out the Canadian command post by mistake. The detonations, visible even from the war base's distant towers, sent shockwaves through the command structure. The radio erupted in horror. Friendly fire, came the calls again and again. More than 30 Canadians were hit in those seconds. As news crackled back to the USA warbase, faces went pale. This was the worst-case scenario. Friendly fire, leadership decimated, mission on the brink of collapse before it had even truly started. Now in the shelter of the USA warbase, a decision loomed. Would the Canadians pull back and lick their wounds? Would command call for a general retreat, ceding the battlefield and confirming every bitter prediction about peacekeepers under pressure? The operators at Kandahar watched every feed, waiting for the dreaded transmission, a full withdrawal under fire. Instead, something shifted. On the tactical net, Lieutenant Colonel Amer Lavi's voice rang through with chilling resolve, calm in the maelstrom. His force, battered and bleeding, refused to break. "We can still do this," he told Canadian and American higher command. "My soldiers want to finish this fight." When that message reached the core planning rooms of the USA warbase, it hit like a crack of thunder. American advisors, first skeptical, now silent, turned to each other with a new respect for their northern allies. The Canadians, broken but still standing, wanted only one thing: to go back into the fire and meet the enemy head-on. The days to come would show just what that refusal to quit would cost, and just how far courage could carry those who refused to turn from the jaws of destruction. Deep inside the USA warbase, officers and analysts suddenly became witnesses to something raw and startling in those grainy video feeds. A revelation shaped not just by tactics, but by the power of refusing to abandon the mission, no matter the cost. After the smoke cleared from the friendly fire disaster, no one inside the USA warbase at Kandahar could peel their eyes away from the flashing monitors. The operations center was thick with uncertainty, ranks of American and Canadian officers poring over new satellite imagery, tactical maps, and radio transcripts in search of hope. The Canadian battle group had been battered, leadership lines shredded, and the enemy seemed emboldened. For a moment, it felt as if the enemy had managed to do what years of insurgency never could: break the will of a NATO force in open battle. But the story that poured through the wire into the base wasn't about retreat. Instead, it was something nobody expected. Within hours, tidbits of raw battlefield communication started to filter back. Canadian squads, now depleted, fighting for every inch of mud, were not calling for extraction. They were regrouping and planning their next move. Inside the American warbase, generals and battle staff exchanged glances as the situation maps updated. The Canadians were going back in, but not the same way as before. They would change the rules and flip the script that the Taliban had spent months weaving. Canadian field officers, working alongside embedded American advisors, realized that advancing by daylight across open fields was a death sentence. Taliban spotters, perched in holes and sun-drenched grape huts, kept every NATO soldier in their sights. Any movement in the daylight would be answered by a hailstorm of mortar fire and machine gun bursts. The classic tactics had failed. So, a new plan formed on battered notepads and encrypted emails, one that quickly became the whisper of awe throughout the entire USA warbase: night operations. Here was a kind of innovation that surprised even the most seasoned U.S. Special Forces veterans. Canadian infantry were trained with high-tech night vision gear, the kind that the Taliban couldn't counter. Teams slipped out under cover of darkness, moving like ghosts through the grapevine labyrinth. American analysts watching the feeds saw the enemy unravel in confusion. Where did these attackers come from? How could they be so close before a single guard barked a warning? "They move like they're invisible," one U.S. airman muttered over his coffee as heat signatures on infrared screens danced in and out of view. The fighting became hand-to-hand, closer, more desperate, far removed from the drone strikes and long-range clean kills that defined so many American missions. In the tight confines of those mud brick huts and grape drying houses, Canadians went to war with bayonets, rifle butts, grenades hurled room to room. The battle could last hours in a single building. When snipers found high ground, their shots forced Taliban fighters to crawl for cover, paralyzing enemy movement at distances the enemy hadn't believed possible. American spotters at the warbase began jotting down lessons. This was innovation born of necessity and fury. The tactics evolved further. Canadian troops invented a technique the warbase analysts called mouse holing, blasting through compound walls rather than using doors, minimizing ambushes and booby traps. The airbase's battle assessment team recorded every burst from LAV-3 armored vehicles, their rapid-fire cannons finally punching through even the thickest grape hut defenses. Every report flowing back to the U.S. base now included lines of grudging respect from embedded observers. They adapt, they survive, they just don't stop. Artillery played its role too, with the Canadians coordinating some of the heaviest barrages since the Korean War. The rumble of 155 shells was felt even at the war base, where staff marked the bombardment on their whiteboards by the hour. Reports filtered in, grape huts collapsing, Taliban defenses caving under relentless fire, enemy bunkers reduced to ruins. Still, the enemy fought, foreign fighters, veteran extremists, refusing to yield. And the losses for the Canadians stacked up. Within a handful of days, casualty lists crossed the comms into the USA war base, dozens wounded, a growing number of the dead. That kind of toll, by the standards of modern war, would halt most units in their tracks. But American eyes on every video feed saw a different reality. Canadian line officers, wounded and exhausted, kept pushing, sometimes with medical dressings on their arms, sometimes limping, always shouting orders and encouragement. Word began to spread, first in the base's dining halls, then among Pentagon analysts still glued to the events in real time. The Canadians weren't breaking. If anything, the pressure forged them into something even tougher. The enemy was stunned. American war planners were forced to adjust their assessments. Some began quietly passing around the internal memo. No one fights like this unless they've got something more driving them. This is personal now. By night, in the silence of the command tents, the usually unflappable officers in the USA war base had found something different in their Canadian counterparts. A willingness to go wherever the fight demanded, to change tactics on the fly, and to take the fight to an enemy that believed NATO would always fold when the price got high. That expectation had been shattered. What American generals witnessed on those grainy screens from the safety of the war base was more than strategy. It was sheer, raw willpower, an unbreakable line being drawn in the sand, even as the odds seemed impossible. For every fierce innovation and bold maneuver that echoed through the grape fields, the true story of Operation Medusa was written in blood. Inside the secure walls of the USA warbase at Kandahar, analysts and officers tracked every movement, every engagement, every loss. The raw numbers hit with the force of a heavy artillery shell. All the tactical charts in the world couldn't mute the gravity of the human price paid on that ground. As the days bled together, it became clear this was no ordinary push. This was survival measured meter by meter, with the enemy determined to make every advance cost a life. As casualty reports rolled in, usually under flickering fluorescent lights in the base's secure operations rooms, American and Canadian staff worked round the clock to keep updates flowing. Inside the warbase, every headline from the satellite news feeds, itself a nod to the 24-hour vigilance of U.S. military culture, showed the mounting toll. By September 10, 12 Canadians were confirmed dead in action. Over 40 more were wounded, many so badly that the medics from both nations struggled to keep up in forward aid stations. For a battle group of just 2,000 soldiers, numbers like that sent a ripple of disbelief through the analysts at every level. Some had spent an entire tour in Afghanistan and never seen losses at that rate. The base buzzed with a new, unsettling respect. But it wasn't just numbers. Each lost soldier had a name, a hometown, a voice, a photograph that made its way around the screens on the warbase or flashed across memorial slideshows. News of fatalities seemed to travel instantly from the front lines to the furthest corners of the base, a hush falling in dining halls as names were read aloud in evening briefings. For Americans already hardened by years of watching their own compatriots lost in battle, it built a sense of kinship, even awe. What left the deepest mark was the display of valor that not only refused to fade but burned brighter in the darkest hours. Officers led their troops from the front, an act more reminiscent of old war movies than modern combat doctrine, especially in the era of drone strikes and high-tech battlefields. American generals and advisors, more accustomed to directing from distant command centers, saw Canadian lieutenants and NCOs charging through dust and bullets, rallying troops carrying wounded off the field. Stories flooded the base, person-to-person accounts, not just official dispatches. A sergeant dashing into a collapsed grape hut to save a trapped comrade. A corporal already bleeding from a shrapnel wound, refusing evacuation until his squad was safe. American embedded officers began submitting field reports to their command at the USA war base. The language quickly shifted. What started as cautious observations, morale holding but high casualties, turned to genuine admiration. "These guys never stop," wrote Lieutenant Colonel Jim Grooney, an American officer who watched the fight shoulder to shoulder with the Canadians. "They take losses that would have made other units pull back. They don't pull back, they keep moving forward." Officers lead from the front, and their troops follow without question. It was more than military grit, it was personal. No one at the base could ignore the emotional cost, the haunted eyes of survivors, the stories that trickled in. A Canadian medic, still trembling, described treating both his own friends and Taliban fighters under heavy enemy fire. The base's chaplain, American and Canadian alike, stayed busy counseling the emotionally wounded as much as the physical. Some nights, soldiers from both nations gathered behind the thick HESCO barriers outside the chow hall, trading stories and sometimes just staring, wordless, at the Kandahar skyline. The ultimate shock for many in the USA war base was how the Canadians refused to let loss break their drive. Where others might have paused to reorganize, these warriors pressed on, consumed by a desire for justice, vengeance, and completion of the mission. The determination echoed in every after-action review transmitted to the U.S. headquarters, Canadians returning to the fight day after day, often dragging bandaged comrades back into the fray. When the final Taliban holdouts were swept from their fortress compounds and grape huts, the toll was undeniable. The ground was littered with spent shell casings, burnt-out vehicles, and the craters left by both Allied and enemy fire. But as the sun set, casting long shadows over the sprawl of the base, American commanders knew they'd witnessed something historic. This wasn't just about ground gained or enemies killed. It was about the unbreakable spirit that had burned itself into the legacy of every soldier at the USA war base and every officer tuning in thousands of miles away. Inside every secure office and quiet midnight corridor, one truth surged above all. The cost was high, the burden endless, but the valor on display would be remembered by every witness on the base for as long as the story of Afghanistan was told. As the final shots faded and the mortars grew silent, a new reality settled across the USA warbase at Kandahar. The maps, once painted with swirling lines of fire and threat signals, now showed a hard-won silence where the grape fields had become the stuff of legend. The immediate victory belonged to the Canadians. Operation Medusa had succeeded in breaking the Taliban's largest conventional assault since the early days of the war. But within those triumphs were the kind of strategic aftershocks that every analyst in the war base and far beyond scrambled to decode. Word of the battle's outcome spread like wildfire through bunkers and briefing rooms. It wasn't just PowerPoints and casualty reports. The conversations in every tent, along every fortified walkway shifted tone. The question was no longer if Canadian troops could fight, but what the enemy had learned from the maelstrom unleashed in Panjwai. The Taliban, who once brazenly taunted NATO to come and fight openly, had been dealt a blow so brutal that their very doctrine was scorched. An intercepted enemy radio transmission, decoded and relayed to the USA warbase, summed it up with chilling brevity. Never again fight in the open and only death follows. Inside the warbase's intelligence cells, American and Allied analysts worked overtime to process a flood of new data. Enemy tactics, for 5 years lean and evasive, had now been decisively abandoned. No longer would the Taliban try to mass troops and hold territory against the kind of firestorm seen in Operation Medusa. Instead, what emerged from the intelligence summaries was a rapid pivot: roadside bombs, sniper attacks, small unit ambushes. As the months went on, patrols from the war base walked into a new reality. The enemy was going to stretch out the conflict, slow it down, bleed NATO forces drop by drop, and hope to outlast them in a war of attrition. The operational lessons poured into every training seminar, every briefing room, and every quick reaction force that spun up at a moment's notice from the base's gravel airstrips. American units rotating into Kandahar were now briefed, sometimes by those very Canadians who'd survived Panjwai, on what it meant to face an enemy who would no longer fight in lines but in shadows. When new arrivals entered the USA warbase, they'd be told, "Study what happened at Medusa. Learn every mistake, every trick, every victory." No less seismic was the change in the perception of Canada among America's warfighting elite. Pentagon cables and high-level command assessments, classified but echoed in every part of the USA warbase, began to reference the Medusa model: adaptability, resilience, and above all the nerve to fight on when most would have stopped. American generals who once doubted Canada's resolve now pointed to them as an example not just for NATO, but for the world. A report circulated among officers in the base's Joint Operations Command even made Medusa required reading in leadership training. Canada's willingness to engage at close quarters while enduring significant casualties exceeded all coalition expectations. But respect came with a price. The stark images scrolled across the base's monitors day after day: flags at half-mast, coffins loaded onto Raptors, names read aloud in both American and Canadian accents at hastily organized memorials. The toll brought introspection. In the comfort of the USA warbase, some wondered, was the success in the grape fields enough to justify the sacrifice? Would victory be fleeting, or mark a permanent turning point in the struggle for Afghanistan's heart? Meanwhile, in Pentagon Situation Rooms and behind every sealed blast door, Medusa forced the alliance to confront uncomfortable politics. The performance of the Canadians was now on every tongue. If they could do it, why not others? Germany, France, and Italy came under renewed pressure to commit troops to the hottest zones rather than holding back for the safer assignments. Arguments flared in briefing halls. Canada's sacrifice had rewritten the rules of coalition warfare, raising both the standard and the stakes. The inertia within the USA warbase itself was changed forever. Medusa made every incoming unit and new strategist think differently about who their real allies were when the shooting started. Over time, those heated after-action reviews slapped on the screens, debated by multinational teams late into the night, became the backbone of future operations. The day the grape fields of Panjwai went quiet, the world inside the war base grew up fast. Even as the base hummed on, jets roaring overhead, convoys assembling under the relentless Afghan sun, nobody forgot the cost or the lessons. Scars remained, in the faces of soldiers waiting for rotation home, in the letters arriving from a grateful but grieving nation, in the hushed urgency of planning teams sketching the next operation late into the night. If Operation Medusa had proven that Canada would fight and bleed with the world's toughest soldiers, it had also taught every war base in Afghanistan that true victory was measured not just in ground won, but in the grit and spirit needed to survive the darkest hours. And in every shadowy tent and command trailer at the USA warbase, one shared recognition. The map may change, the mission may evolve, but the standard for courage had been set, and it was written across the bullet-riddled grape fields of Panjwai. When dawn broke over the USA warbase at Kandahar, the fields outside seemed strangely peaceful. Yet for the men and women inside, the silence brought its own kind of reckoning. The aftermath of Operation Medusa was not just a string of debriefings, casualty counts, or commendation ceremonies. It was a tide of memories, regrets, pride, and questions, each one rippling from the crowded hallways of the base to the far-off towns where the fallen had grown up. Inside the base, American and Canadian soldiers often crossed paths in makeshift memorials. Rows of boots, rifles, and dog tags bathed in the golden light of early morning. Honor guards, silent and stoic, paid tribute to those who would never walk through the wire again. The losses cut deep, and each ceremony brought the war home. A name was read aloud, sometimes by a trembling voice still raw from battle, and somewhere in the crowd a friend or comrade would grip his cap tighter, fighting back tears. Even the most battle-hardened Marines exchanged solemn nods of respect, acknowledging that what had happened beyond the perimeter had changed their perception of service and sacrifice. The reverberations at the USA warbase didn't stop with the survivors. They echoed across North America, reverberating in the homes of parents, spouses, and children waiting on the other side of the world. Photos circulated across the base, tacked to corkboards and digital screens, smiling young faces, high school prom pictures, wedding shots from small-town Canada. These reminders shaped every quiet moment in the chow hall, every late-night phone call home, every glance at a comrade during a lull in the day's chaos. Stories filtered back into the base from the fields and roads outside Kandahar. There was Captain John Hamilton, just 26 when he fell in the opening phase of the battle, leading from the front. His leadership in those first uncertain hours became legend in both American and Canadian after-action reports, a case study shared in junior officer briefings at the USA warbase long after the guns fell silent. There was Corporal Anthony Banka, whose mother would travel across the world just to touch the dirt where her son had given everything. His sacrifice became a symbol of the distances traveled and costs paid, not only by soldiers but by the families who sent them to war. Some legacies were less visible, but every bit as profound. Master's Corporal Aaron Doyle, a sniper scarred by the nightmares of what he'd survived and what he'd done, would later speak at mental health seminars sponsored by both American and Canadian military chaplains at the war base. His pain, like that of so many, drove new resources into peer support and trauma relief, lessons not lost on the policymakers updating field manuals in the base's headquarters buildings. At times, the stories that reached the war base challenged the very notion of heroism. Canadian medics treating wounded Taliban fighters even after losing their own to the same enemy's bullets. Local villagers caught between two worlds, grateful as much for new schools as for the hope that the fighting would cease. These threads wove into a tapestry of impossible choices, a reminder that while battles are fought on maps in the base's briefing tents, the consequences are shouldered by real people every day for years to come. Yet the reckoning wasn't just personal, it was national. At the USA warbase, Canadian officers found they could hold their heads higher, no longer shadowed by the peacekeeper stereotype but respected by the U.S. military for grit under fire. Debates raged nightly in the rec halls and around the sandbagged gathering spots. Was it worth it? Could the outcome in those distant fields justify the names etched into marble back home? Some pointed to the haunting reality that, years later, the enemy retook the very ground Medusa had claimed. Others argued that acts of courage and character transcended outcomes. That's what made Operation Medusa more than just another combat operation in the long ledger of the Afghan war. Long after the battle's end, as new units rotated through the USA warbase, Medusa's memory lingered. It became a phrase in doctrine, a story in training, a point of pride passed from one squad to the next. New generations of American and Canadian troops learned the tale not only as a warning of what courage demands, but as a promise that ordinary people placed in impossible circumstances can change how a nation is seen, both at home and by every ally and adversary who watches from afar. For the men and women who had witnessed the fight from inside the protected walls, and for those who still walked them each day, Operation Medusa would stand forever as a reminder. In war, legacy is built not just in victories, but in the courage and sacrifice of those who refuse to break, even when the world expects them to. As the dust finally settled over Kandahar, the atmosphere inside the USA war base had changed in ways no report or satellite feed could fully capture. Operation Medusa was over. But its shadow stretched across every hallway, briefing tent, and classified network, forever altering how Canadian soldiers were seen, not just by Americans, but by military leaders around the world. In the months that followed, those echoing lessons were debated from mess halls in the Afghan desert to high-security conference rooms back in Washington, D.C. For American generals at the helm of base operations, Medusa became a defining chapter in coalition warfare. The battle exposed raw realities that war colleges had only theorized, that grit and willpower could sometimes outweigh even the best odds stacked by numbers and geography. In strategy sessions at the heart of the USA war base, it was Canada's doctrine of adapt and overcome that caught the attention of seasoned commanders. The relentless forward pushes, the midnight raids, and the refusal to break, these weren't the actions of so-called soft peacekeepers, but of born warriors shaped by desperation, determination, and brotherhood. Signals intelligence teams and field observers at the USA warbase began compiling lessons from every stage of Operation Medusa. One internal review read, "Canadian forces demonstrated a level of ingenuity under pressure that surprised even our most experienced officers." The term Canadian courage became not just a phrase, but a case study, one pinned to whiteboards and planning trailers, and analyzed by visiting staff from across the NATO alliance. If anyone doubted these lessons, the casualty numbers, the personal stories of heroism, and the sheer cost written on the faces of every Canadian returning from those grape fields were proof enough. But behind all the tactics and strategies, something even more enduring left its mark inside the USA warbase, a sense of kinship forged in fire. American and Canadian soldiers, once separated by stereotype or national habit, now shared a bond tested in the ultimate crucible. On nights when helicopters thudded out to remote outposts and convoys rumbled through the gates, it was clear. When the chips were down, Canada did not simply stand by, they stood in front. The Pentagon paid attention. Testimonies before Congress and classified briefings for the highest brass in Washington singled out the Canadians' performance. Medusa became a touchstone for discussions about what real alliance means, echoing through every future deployment from the base. The Canadians had provided the world's most battle-tested military with not just extra manpower, but ironclad proof that valor and sacrifice came in all uniforms, from all backgrounds. Yet for all the respect won and doctrine reshaped, the final reckoning of Operation Medusa lingered, not only for those who fought, but for every policymaker, strategist, and young recruit stepping onto the flight line at the USA war base. Was it worth the price paid in blood, spirit, and years of rebuilding? Could any mission justify the grief etched into the highway of heroes, stretching continents away from Kandahar's brown dirt? No military analysis offers an easy answer. One truth, however, was repeated in every post-battle summary and late-night reflection around the secure warbase. The Canadians did not let fear or loss dictate their fate. They stepped forward when history called, forcing the world, including America's mightiest leaders, to see them in a new light. As one anonymous U.S. commander confided to his staff inside the command post, "You put those guys in a fight, you'll see things you never thought possible." So when the sun set each evening over the base, and the guard towers blinked on across the horizon, it wasn't just a question of what had changed on the map. It was about what had changed inside every soldier and general who watched courage unfold in real time. Medusa was more than a Canadian story. It was a mirror for every warrior on the base, a reminder that legends are not born in headlines, but in the quiet moments after the shooting stops, when the cost is finally clear. The war base carried forward the lesson that true strength isn't measured in numbers but in spirit. And as helicopters lifted off one last time over the blood-soaked fields, the legacy of Operation Medusa circled out from Kandahar, etched forever into the annals of those who witnessed it, and those who came after, searching for meaning in the silence that followed the storm.